The crystal goblet did not even shake in her hand when my daughter hit the floor. We were sitting around the dining room table, the rich smell of roasted prime rib filling the air when my son-in-law backhanded my daughter across the face. The sound cracked through the room like a bullwhip. My daughter stumbled backward, her shoulder slamming hard into the glass of the antique china cabinet, her hand instantly flying to her bleeding lip. I froze. But what made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice was not just the brutal strike. It was his mother, Lucille, sitting directly across from me. She calmly set down her wine glass, began to slowly clap her hands together, and smirked. "That is how women learn their place," Lucille said, taking a slow, unbothered sip of her Cabernet. I did not scream. I did not cry. I stood up without a single word, reached into my purse, took out my phone, and made one call. They thought I was just a helpless, grieving widow. They could bully. They had no idea who they were really messing with. My name is Josephine Sterling. I am 68 years old. I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, and I spent 40 years building Sterling Freight from one rusty delivery truck into a commercial freight and logistics company with terminals across the Midwest. I survived boardrooms where men twice my size mistook age, race, and silence for weakness. I learned early that the person shouting loudest was rarely the person holding the strongest hand. By the time Trent married my daughter Maya, I had already buried my husband. Elias survived 2 recessions, a fuel crisis, a union strike, and more hostile negotiations than I could count. None of that frightened me as much as seeing fear settle into my daughter's eyes. And once I understood what was happening inside her home, I stopped thinking like a mother who wanted an apology. I started thinking like the woman who had spent a lifetime tracing losses to their source and closing every exit before the responsible party knew the doors were locked. The road to that single phone call began 3 months earlier during the sweltering heat of a Chicago July. The humidity was thick enough to cut with a knife, the kind of heavy summer afternoon where the air conditioning struggles to keep up and the heat waves shimmer off the asphalt. I was hosting our usual Sunday family barbecue out on my back patio overlooking the lake. The grill was smoking, filled with ribs and hot links, while my staff brought out wide silver trays of potato salad and collard greens. Despite the 90-degree temperature and the suffocating moisture in the air, my daughter arrived wearing a heavy, thick-knit, long-sleeved cashmere cardigan. She kept pulling the sleeves down over her wrists, her posture rigid, her eyes constantly darting toward the driveway where her husband was parking his luxury car. I offered her a glass of iced lemonade, watching the sweat bead on her forehead. She gave me a tight, fragile smile, refusing to take off the sweater. I knew something was profoundly wrong, but 40 years of running a logistics empire had taught me never to tip my hand until I possessed the full shipping manifest. The moment of absolute clarity arrived when my caterer brought out a heavy cast-iron platter of brisket. The server stumbled slightly on a loose paver, and Maya reached out quickly to steady the heavy tray. The sudden jerky movement caused her heavy cashmere sleeve to ride up past her elbow. There, stark and undeniable against her brown skin, was a cluster of deep, dark purple bruises. They were unmistakable. 4 distinct oval marks on one side of her forearm and a larger thumb-shaped contusion on the other. A grip mark. Someone had grabbed her with enough violent force to break blood vessels deep beneath the skin. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped forward, reaching for her arm, the maternal instinct overriding my business restraint for just a fraction of a second. Before my fingers could even brush her skin, a large hand clamped down over her wrist and yanked her sleeve violently back into place. It was Trent. He had walked up behind us without making a single sound. His smile was perfectly manufactured, bright, and utterly devoid of any actual warmth. His eyes were flat and dead, like a shark sizing up a meal. "She is so clumsy in the gym," Mama Joe, Trent said smoothly, pulling Maya flush against his chest in a gesture that looked like affection to a stranger, but felt entirely like a threat to me. She was trying to lift a kettlebell that was way too heavy for her and lost her balance. "I keep telling her to let me spot her, but you know how stubborn your daughter can be." Maya nodded quickly, looking at the stone pavers beneath our feet instead of at my face. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the patio fountain. "Just a gym accident. I am fine." I looked at the bruising again, then up into Trent's cold eyes. I did not argue. I did not call him a liar. I simply smiled a slow, calculated smile and handed him a plate of brisket. I told him to eat up because he looked like a man who burned a lot of energy. He took the plate completely unaware that in that exact moment, I had mentally moved him from the category of family to the category of a liability that needed to be permanently liquidated. The situation escalated rapidly the very next week when Trent's mother, Lucille, announced she was moving into the guest house on Maya and Trent's property. Lucille had lost her own home in a bitter divorce years ago and had been bouncing between luxury rentals ever since. She arrived with 40 boxes of designer clothes, 3 purebred lapdogs, and an attitude that instantly poisoned the air. Within 48 hours of unpacking, Lucille was acting like the undisputed lady of the manor. She fired Maya's housekeeper of 10 years, claiming the woman was stealing, and replaced her with a cheaper cleaning service that Lucille herself managed. She redecorated the guest house using Maya's credit cards, buying antique French furniture and imported silk drapes, complaining loudly that my daughter's taste was too heavily influenced by my so-called new money grit. She sneered at my South Side roots every chance she got, sipping tea on the veranda, while Maya scrambled to cater to her endless demands. But the redecorating was just a smokescreen for something much more insidious. I began to notice things missing from Maya's wardrobe during our weekly lunches. First, it was the vintage emerald brooch Elias had bought me in Paris, which I had passed down to Maya on her wedding day. Maya claimed she had misplaced it at a charity gala. Then, the diamond and sapphire drop earrings vanished. Next went the platinum Cartier watch. Maya always had an excuse, looking more exhausted and terrified with each passing week, spinning stories about sending the pieces out for cleaning or letting a friend borrow them. I knew the truth. Lucille was systematically stripping my daughter of her heirloom jewelry. I hired a private investigator to monitor the high-end pawn shops and private estate jewelers in the Gold Coast district. Sure enough, 3 days later, my investigator sent me photographs of Lucille walking out of a discreet jewelry broker's office. She was pawning the family heirlooms for straight cash. I was building the dossier brick by brick, waiting for them to make a mistake that crossed from petty theft into federal territory. That fatal mistake happened on a quiet Thursday morning. I was sitting in my corner office at Sterling Freight reviewing quarterly shipping manifests when my private line rang. It was Marcus Vance, the senior wealth manager at my primary bank. He sounded incredibly tense, speaking in hushed tones. Josephine, Marcus said, clearing his throat nervously. "We just flagged 3 highly suspicious wire transfer requests. Someone is attempting to move massive amounts of capital out of the educational trust account you established for your grandson Malik." I set down my pen, the leather of my executive chair creaking as I leaned forward. "How much capital, Marcus?" "They attempted to wire $50,000 to a holding company in the Cayman Islands," he replied. "When that hit our security block, they tried 2 smaller transfers of $9,000 to a domestic account registered in Florida. The security protocols you instituted last year required secondary voice authorization for anything involving Malik's trust, so the transfers are frozen. But Josephine, the digital requests originated from your daughter's home IP address." Trent and Lucille were getting desperate. They had moved past pawning jewelry and were now directly targeting a minors' protected trust fund. They were testing the fences, trying to find a weak point in my financial perimeter. "Do not decline the transfers." "Marcus," I instructed, my mind racing through the strategic implications. "Leave them in a pending status. Put a silent freeze on the entire trust, but let the user interface show that the transaction is merely processing due to routine network delays. I want them to think they are succeeding. I want them to keep trying." I hung up the phone and stood by my office window, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. I knew that if I marched over to their house right now and confronted Trent, he would spin a web of lies. He would claim Maya made the transfer or that their network was hacked. He would use the confrontation as an excuse to completely isolate Maya, potentially taking her and Malik out of the state before I could mobilize my legal team. I needed undeniable, digital proof of his specific involvement. I needed the exact routing numbers and the destination accounts. I decided to wait. I let them sweat, let them think the money was just held up in bureaucratic red tape. I knew their greed would eventually force them into making a sloppy, fatal error. That error brought the storm directly to my front door. It was a rainy Tuesday night, the kind of torrential Midwest downpour that turns the streets into rivers and keeps everyone locked tightly inside their homes. The wind was howling, rattling the heavy glass panes of my conservatory. I was sitting by the fireplace, drinking a cup of herbal tea and reviewing the private investigator's latest photos of Lucille when my security system chimed. The alert showed motion at my back gate. I pulled up the camera feed on my tablet. A small, hooded figure was running frantically up my driveway, dodging the puddles slipping on the wet cobblestones. It was my 16-year-old grandson, Malik. I dropped my teacup, rushed through the kitchen, and threw open the heavy back door. Malik practically fell into my kitchen. He was soaking wet his sneakers, leaving muddy footprints across the imported tile. His teeth were chattering violently from the cold, but his arms were wrapped fiercely around his backpack, clutching it to his chest like a lifeline to keep the rain off the canvas material. "Malik, baby, what are you doing out in this terrible weather?" I asked, grabbing a thick towel from the pantry and wrapping it tightly around his shivering shoulders. "Why did you not call me to send a driver?" He did not answer my question. He refused the hot chocolate I offered. He simply marched over to my kitchen island, unzipped his soaked backpack with shaking hands, and carefully pulled out a heavy matte black laptop and an encrypted external hard drive. He looked up at me. His eyes, usually so quiet and reserved, burned with a fierce, brilliant intensity. "Grandma Joe," Malik whispered, looking over his shoulder toward the door, as if he expected Trent to burst through the wood at any second. "Trent thinks I am just a stupid kid. He thinks I just sit in my room playing video games on my laptop all day while he terrorizes Mom." He plugged the external drive into his computer and opened a folder he had created for copies of records already visible through the household systems Maya authorized him to maintain. There were screenshots, connection logs, downloaded statements, and alerts he had saved before they could disappear. His hands moved quickly, but his voice did not sound excited. It sounded frightened. "I started keeping the router logs because things were disappearing," he said. "Bank notices would show up and then vanish. Trent kept using the home network late at night, and Mom's accounts would change the next morning. I did not get into the bank or guess his passwords. I saved the activity I could see from the network and the family backup, so somebody who actually knows what they are doing can check it." He opened a directory organized by date. Each folder contained the source of the record and a note explaining where he had found it. It was not a hacker's trophy case. It was a frightened teenager's attempt to keep facts from being erased. "Grandma," Malik said, meeting my eyes, "I think he and Lucille are draining Mom's trust. I found documents for a Miami penthouse under a company called Biscayne Horizon. I found account references that match the missing statements and messages about moving money before Mom files for divorce. I do not know how much of this the police can use, but I know something is happening." I stood still beside the kitchen island. Malik had not handed me a finished criminal case. He had handed me a warning, a timeline, and enough names and dates to ask the right people the right questions. That was more valuable than pretending we already knew everything. Malik set the laptop on my kitchen island and opened the network dashboard he had built to help maintain the house system. Maya had given him administrator access months earlier because Trent refused to deal with routine security updates. Malik had started keeping connection logs after noticing late-night sessions from Trent's laptop to banking and virtual currency services. He had not broken into the bank. What he had captured were timestamps, destination domains, device identifiers, downloaded documents that had been left in a shared family folder, and a series of synced messages visible on a household backup account Maya herself owned. It was enough to show a pattern, but Malik understood that a pattern was not the same as courtroom proof. He filtered the logs by device. One stream belonged to Trent's laptop, another to Lucille's tablet. The suspicious sessions appeared again and again shortly after Maya went to sleep. Malik had matched several of those sessions to missing bank statements and notices that had briefly appeared in Maya's email before being deleted. He had also saved copies of automated alerts from the trust administrator, all time-stamped within minutes of Trent's activity. Instead of boasting about hacking anything, he looked at me with the sober expression of a boy who knew he had stumbled onto something much bigger than family dishonesty. Then he opened a spreadsheet. He had organized every suspicious event by date, amount, device, and destination account. The entries showed a progression: small transfers at first, then larger ones, then a $200,000 movement the previous morning. At the bottom, his running total reached $4.2 million. Some rows came directly from Maya's statements. Others came from alerts and files Trent had carelessly stored on the home system. The picture was incomplete, but the direction of the money was unmistakable. I stared at the figure until the numbers stopped looking like numbers and became years of my daughter's future. $4.2 million was not simply wealth. It was the trust Elias and I had built, so Maya would never have to remain in a dangerous marriage because she was financially trapped. Trent had understood exactly what that money represented, and that was why he wanted it. "How is he making the transfers look authorized?" I asked. Malik opened copies of several approval forms that had been saved to the shared drive. The signatures looked like Maya's at first glance, but the dates, formatting, and metadata told a different story. "He has been using copies of Mom's digital signature files," Malik said. "Some approvals were generated in the middle of the night. Others were submitted while Mom was physically with me somewhere else. I cannot prove who pressed the button on every transaction, but the bank can. They will have device logs, authentication records, and the destination information. I saved what I could so nothing disappears before they look." That distinction mattered. I did not need my grandson playing detective beyond what was safe or lawful. I needed professionals to take the fragments he had preserved and compare them with records that could survive a courtroom. I told him not to access another account, not to touch Trent's devices, and not to delete or alter a single file. From that moment forward, preservation mattered more than discovery. A legal document flashed onto the screen. It was a deed of trust and a commercial real estate purchase agreement. The primary buyer was listed as Biscayne Horizon LLC. "It is a luxury penthouse in Miami," Malik said, pulling up the detailed architectural floor plans and the official escrow deposit receipts. 4 bedrooms, a private elevator, an unobstructed ocean view. They close on the property in exactly 14 days. The LLC is registered in Delaware for tax anonymity, but the primary managing members are explicitly listed as Trent and Lucille. My grandson minimized the real estate contract and opened a raw text document filled with extracted communication logs. Lucille syncs her text messages across all her Apple devices. She leaves her tablet connected to the home network when she sleeps in the guest house. My script pulled her entire daily cloud backup directly from the router. He highlighted a specific conversation thread between Trent and his mother dated 3 days ago. Trent's message read clearly on the bright screen. "The transfer cleared. The escrow account is fully funded." Maya asked about the missing bank statements today. I handled it. She will not ask again. Lucille's response glared at me from the display. "Drain it before she files for divorce. The old woman will not notice until we are gone." A cold, absolute silence filled my kitchen. The sheer audacity of the financial theft combined with the calculated physical violence I now knew was happening to my daughter crystallized into a singular, undeniable objective. Malik looked up at me, fear finally overtaking the adrenaline that had carried him through the rain. "We have enough to call someone, Grandma Joe. We cannot just sit here while he hurts Mom and moves her money." He reached for his phone. I did not stop him. I asked one question first. "Is Maya in immediate danger right now?" Malik shook his head. She had gone to a friend's charity committee meeting, and Trent believed Malik was still upstairs. I told him that if he ever believed his mother was being attacked or trapped, he was to call 911 before he called me. But for the financial evidence, I said, "We are not going to confront Trent tonight and warn him that we know what he is doing. We will preserve what you found, alert the bank, speak to lawyers, and take it to investigators who can obtain the records properly." Malik frowned. "He is stealing millions. Why should we give him another minute? Because an accusation is not the same as a case," I told him. "If I charge into that house waving screenshots, Trent will deny everything, destroy what he can, and use the confrontation to isolate Maya further. The police can respond to violence, and the bank can stop suspicious transfers. But the larger scheme crosses accounts, companies, and jurisdictions. We need the people with authority to freeze records and trace the money before Trent realizes the path is exposed." I pointed to the folders on Malik's screen. "Your mother's safety comes first. The money comes second. But if we can protect both without tipping him off, that is what we are going to do. We are not trying to out-hack him or chase money around the world ourselves. We are going to make sure the records survive long enough for the right people to act." Malik lowered the phone. "So what do we do tonight?" "We make copies of what you already have," I said. "We call Marcus and place additional safeguards on the trusts. Then we stop collecting and start documenting. In freight, when cargo goes missing, the first useful question is not who deserves to be yelled at. It is where the chain of custody broke." I wrote down the company names, account references, and timestamps Malik had preserved. Trent and Lucille appeared to be building a financial escape route, but I had no intention of chasing them through it alone. I wanted the bank watching the doors and investigators ready to follow the trail. I walked over to my home office door, keyed in the security code, and opened my primary wall safe. I pulled out a heavy stack of blank commercial real estate contracts documents I used for massive warehouse acquisitions. "You have given me the intelligence, Malik," I said, returning to the kitchen island and setting the contracts down next to his computer. "Now I am going to build the trap." The heavy steel doors of the Sterling freight elevator slid open, and I stepped out onto the executive floor. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my heels as I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms. The low rumble of 18-wheelers idling in the loading bays far below vibrated through the floorboards. This was my sanctuary. This was the empire I built with sheer grit and relentless calculation. I walked into my corner office and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the massive logistics operation moving like a well-oiled machine. I checked my watch. Trent was exactly 4 minutes late. I turned away from the window and walked over to my heavy mahogany desk. I picked up my phone and dialed the security desk in the lobby. "Send him up as soon as he arrives," I instructed the head guard, "and make sure he gets a visitor badge printed with his full legal name." 5 minutes later, my office door swung open. Trent strolled in holding a cup of overpriced artisan coffee, wearing a tailored navy suit that looked completely ridiculous in a working freight terminal. He looked around my office, his eyes lingering greedily on the framed shipping maps and the massive whiteboards covered in complex supply chain algorithms. He carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who truly believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. "Have a seat, Trent," I said, making a deliberate effort to sound weary and strained. I walked over to the crystal decanter on my side table and poured 2 generous glasses of aged bourbon. I handed him one and sat down heavily in my leather chair, letting my shoulders slump forward just a fraction. I needed him to see a tired, aging woman who was desperate to hand over her heavy burdens. "You look exhausted," Mama Joe Trent said, taking a slow sip of the bourbon. His voice was laced with a sickly, sweet, false concern. "Running this entire operation by yourself must be taking a massive toll on your health." "It is taking a toll, Trent," I replied, letting out a long, dramatic sigh. "My doctor told me last week that my blood pressure is reaching a critical level. I cannot keep working 14-hour days, negotiating with union leaders and international shipping conglomerates. I need an immediate exit strategy." Trent leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His eyes gleamed with raw, unfiltered opportunity. "What kind of exit strategy are you considering?" I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, glossy presentation portfolio. I slid it slowly across the polished wood surface toward him. "I am looking at a massive new commercial development," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "I have secured the permits for 50 acres of undeveloped industrial land near the airport. We are planning to build a state-of-the-art, fully automated warehouse district. It is a $50 million project that will completely dominate the regional logistics market within 3 years." Trent opened the portfolio. He stared at the detailed architectural renderings and the highly inflated projected revenue charts my team had mocked up the night before. His pupils physically dilated as he read the numbers. "This is an absolute gold mine," he whispered, tracing his finger over the profit margins. "But why would an exit strategy involve taking on a massive new development project?" "Because I have no intention of building it myself," I told him, locking my eyes directly onto his. "I want to fund the initial land acquisition step entirely out of the daily operations and let a younger, hungrier partner take the reins. I want to transition into a silent advisory role and watch the dividends roll in while I sit on my porch." I let the silence stretch between us for several seconds. I watched the gears turning rapidly behind his eyes. He was already calculating exactly how he could maneuver himself into that managing position and bleed the construction funds dry. "The problem is that I do not know who to trust with this level of capital exposure," I continued, shaking my head sadly. "Maya is a wonderful daughter, but she is far too soft for this kind of ruthless corporate warfare. And Malik is a brilliant boy, but he is just a computer nerd who belongs in a laboratory. I need a shark. I need a man who understands aggressive expansion and is completely unafraid to crush the competition to get what he wants." Trent sat up completely straight. He set his bourbon glass down on my desk with a loud, solid thud. "You are looking at him, Mama Joe. I know exactly how to maximize commercial margins. I know how to aggressively leverage corporate assets. You give me the authority to run this warehouse development, and I will make sure you never have to worry about a single operational detail ever again." I smiled warmly at him, completely hiding the absolute disgust twisting in my stomach. You really believe you have the capability to handle a massive infrastructure project of this magnitude, Trent? He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on my desk. I absolutely guarantee it. I am exactly the kind of ruthless partner you need to bring sterling freight into the modern era. I nodded slowly, putting on a masterful performance of a woman convinced by his empty bravado. There is just one significant financial hurdle we need to clear, Trent. The primary holding company requires a lead guarantor to secure the initial bridge loan for the land acquisition. I cannot sign the guarantee because my personal assets are heavily leveraged in the existing truck fleet and current operational liabilities. If you want to be the managing partner and take a 60% equity stake in the new district, you have to be the primary signatory on the contract. You have to be the face of the financial liability. Trent did not even hesitate for a single second. I can do that. I am completely ready to step up. I picked up a gold pen and tapped it thoughtfully against the desk. The corporate board also requires a secondary co-signer, someone with separate verifiable liquid assets to secure the liability clause. It is just a minor bureaucratic formality to satisfy the banking examiners, but it is completely non-negotiable. A sly, greedy grin spread across Trent's face. I thought he had just stumbled into the greatest heist of his miserable life. He thought he was going to use my capital to build a warehouse district, siphon the construction funds into his offshore accounts, and leave me holding the empty bag while he escaped to Miami. My mother recently came into some very significant capital, Trent said smoothly. She has been actively looking for a safe, high-yield domestic investment portfolio to park her money in. She would jump at the absolute chance to co-sign a venture with Sterling Freight. Are you entirely sure she would be willing to take on that kind of legal exposure? I asked, feigning deep concern. She trusts my business instincts completely, Trent assured me, his voice brimming with arrogant confidence. I will explain the 60-40 equity split to her tonight at dinner. We can have this finalized immediately. I stood up, extending my hand across the wide desk. Bring her to my office tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I will have my legal team draft the partnership agreements tonight. Trent stood up and shook my hand firmly. He quickly finished his bourbon, picked up the glossy portfolio, and walked out of my office looking like a man who had just conquered the world. I watched the heavy door close securely behind him. I walked straight over to the wet bar, poured my untouched bourbon down the drain, and picked up my secure phone to call my attorneys. The next morning, the sky over Chicago was a brilliant, clear blue. Exactly at 9 o'clock, my office door opened. Trent and Lucille marched in together. Lucille was wearing a tailored white pantsuit and a string of authentic pearls. She carried a designer handbag that cost more than most of my drivers made in an entire month. She looked around my functional industrial office with a thinly veiled expression of aristocratic distaste. Josephine, Lucille said, taking a seat in front of my desk without waiting to be offered one. Trent told me all about your little expansion project last night. It sounds like quite the undertaking for a woman your age. I am very glad my son is stepping in to rescue your operation. I smiled politely, completely ignoring the blatant insult. I am very grateful for his ambition, Lucille, and I truly appreciate your willingness to back him financially. My legal team had delivered the contract an hour earlier. It sat squarely in the center of my desk. It was a massive document bound in thick black leather, containing exactly 400 pages of dense, highly complex legal terminology. I slid the heavy binder across the polished desk toward them. I deliberately placed 2 expensive gold pens right next to the signature lines on the final page. The contract clearly outlines the 60-40 equity split in Trent's favor, I explained calmly. It names him as the primary managing director of the new warehouse district. It names you, Lucille, as the secondary financial guarantor. You just need to sign the last page and initial the specific liability waivers in Appendix B. Trent picked up a gold pen immediately. Lucille hesitated for a fraction of a second. Should we perhaps have our attorney look this over first? She asked, placing a manicured hand over the thick leather cover. You are certainly welcome to do that, I replied, keeping my tone entirely neutral and unbothered. But the preferred bridge loan interest rate expires exactly at noon today. If we delay the signing to wait for your lawyers to review 400 pages, we lose the preferred rate, and the total development costs immediately increase by $2 million. It is entirely up to you. I knew their profound greed would completely override their caution. They did not want to pay expensive hourly legal fees to review a contract they believed was just a bureaucratic formality. They wanted the 60% equity stake, and they wanted it right now. Trent looked sharply at his mother. "We do not need a lawyer to read a standard commercial partnership agreement, Mom. We are literally leaving money on the table every single minute we wait." Lucille nodded slowly, her desperate desire for wealth blinding her completely to the imminent danger. She picked up the second gold pen. They did not read a single page of the actual contract. They did not read the dense paragraphs detailing the structure of the holding company. They flipped directly to the back of the massive binder. Trent signed his name with a bold, sweeping flourish. Lucille signed her name right beneath his, her handwriting sharp and precise. They eagerly initialed the boxes in the appendix, exactly where my lawyers had placed the bright yellow sticky notes. I watched the dark ink dry on the thick paper. My heart beat with a steady rhythmic thud against my ribs. "Excellent," I said, taking the heavy binder and pulling it smoothly back across the desk. "I will have these documents filed with the city clerk this afternoon. Welcome to the partnership." Trent stood up confidently, buttoning his suit jacket. "We are going to make a lot of money together, Mama Joe. I will start reviewing the initial construction bids tonight. I look forward to seeing your work," I replied. Lucille stood up, smoothing her pristine white pantsuit. She gave me a deeply condescending smile. "It takes a real man to handle commercial real estate, Josephine. You absolutely made the right choice stepping aside." I walked them to the door and watched them head down the long hallway toward the elevators. They were laughing together, whispering excitedly about property values and massive profit margins. I closed my office door and locked it securely. I walked over to the large painting of the Chicago skyline hanging on my far wall. I swung the painting open on its hidden hinges, revealing my biometric wall safe. I punched in the complex security code and placed my thumb firmly on the scanner. The heavy steel door popped open silently. I slid the 400-page contract inside and firmly closed the safe. The steel locking bolt slammed into place with a loud, heavy metallic clank that echoed through the quiet office. Trent and Lucille thought they had just secured a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. They thought they had successfully manipulated a tired, retiring old woman into handing over the keys to her hard-earned kingdom. They had no idea the document was designed less as a business opportunity than as a due diligence trap. Buried in the guarantor schedules were broad but ordinary-looking disclosures requiring each signatory to identify every company in which he or she held a beneficial interest, certify the source of the assets offered as collateral, and consent to verification with banks, escrow agents, and regulators. Biscayne Horizon LLC appeared in the schedules because my lawyers had placed it there after Malik found the name. By initialing those pages, Trent and Lucille personally represented that they controlled the company and the accounts connected to it. They had not signed away constitutional rights, and no private contract could give me police powers. What they had done was far more useful. They had placed their own signatures beneath admissions they would later struggle to explain. The contract alone could not seize a dollar or send anyone to prison. But paired with the bank's fraud alerts, Maya's statements, the pawn records, the suspicious authentication history, and Malik's preserved household logs, it could give federal investigators the missing link between the people in my dining room and the shell company in Miami. The bait was taken. The next step was not revenge. It was evidence. The morning sunlight hit the frosted glass of my office door as I pulled the leather binder from my wall safe. Malik sat across from me, exhausted from a night spent copying the files he had already preserved onto read-only storage, so nothing could be altered by accident. I set the contract in front of him and opened it to the signature page. Trent's and Lucille's names were there in dark ink. The sight did not make me feel triumphant. It made the next step possible. Malik leaned forward, tracing his finger over his father's bold signature. "What exactly did they sign, Grandma Joe?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. I flipped to the guarantor schedules in Appendix B. "They did not sign away their rights," I explained. "No contract I write can do that. What they did was certify the ownership and source of the assets they offered to support the supposed project. They listed Biscayne Horizon identified accounts associated with it and authorized our lender and compliance team to verify those representations. If they had read the pages, they would have noticed that they were putting their own names beside the very shell company they had tried to hide behind." Malik stared at the text. "So the contract makes them admit the company is theirs." "Exactly," I said. It does not let me search their bank accounts, and it does not let the government skip a judge. What it does is give investigators signed statements to compare against the bank alerts, the forged authorizations, the escrow paperwork, and the records they can obtain through lawful process. Trent built his plan around deniability. I expected every suspicious transfer to end at a company that appeared disconnected from him. Yesterday, he signed a document connecting himself to it. I placed the binder in my briefcase and slid Malik's preserved files into a protective sleeve. I reminded him again that from this point forward, he was not to investigate anything. He had done enough. The next people touching those records would be lawyers, bank investigators, and federal agents who knew how to preserve a chain of custody. My private driver brought the car around to the front of the logistics terminal. I instructed him to take us straight to the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago. The drive through the city was quiet. The rain from the previous night had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the gray morning sky. I looked out the tinted window at the towering skyscrapers, thinking about the empire I had built and the mediocre man who thought he could steal a piece of it. I had spent 40 years navigating sharks in tailored suits. Trent was just a guppy who had swam too far from the shoreline. We passed through security at the Dirksen Federal Building. I had met Special Agent Thomas Harrison years earlier during a cargo theft investigation involving one of my terminals, so I called him rather than trying to turn a complicated financial case into a hurried complaint at a front desk. He had told me to bring only the original records, a timeline, and the people who could explain where each item came from. Harrison waited for us in a secure conference room. I was not impressed by family drama, wealth, or threats. He cared about dates, account numbers, signatures, and whether a fact could be independently verified. That was exactly the kind of person I wanted in the room. I placed my leather briefcase on his metal table. I opened it and set the 400-page contract in front of him. Then I set Malik's encrypted hard drive right next to it. "Good morning, Thomas," I said, taking a seat across from him. "I have brought you a perfectly wrapped gift. It involves multi-million-dollar wire fraud, international money laundering, and a conspiracy to commit severe financial exploitation." Harrison raised an eyebrow, picking up the heavy binder. He adjusted his reading glasses and flipped immediately to the signature pages, then back to the liability clauses I had flagged with yellow sticky notes. He read the dense legal text in complete silence. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the ventilation system and the faint ticking of a wall clock. After several minutes, Harrison looked up at me. A rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Josephine," he said, "this is useful, very useful." They certified beneficial ownership of Biscayne Horizon, identified accounts they intended to use as collateral, and consented to financial verification for the transaction. That does not replace a warrant, but it gives us signed admissions tying them to entities they have been trying to keep at arm's length. Malik preserved the household trail, I said. The bank has the real transaction records. The contract ties Trent and Lucille to the company receiving the money. I want you to tell me what can actually be proved. Harrison called in a cyber forensics specialist who made a forensic copy of Malik's drive and documented every step. Malik explained how the household network logs had been collected and which records came from Maya's own accounts or shared family storage. The specialist repeatedly separated what could be treated as a lead from what would require independent confirmation from a service provider. "This gives us timestamps and targets," Harrison said, after reviewing the first set of logs. "We will verify the rest through the bank, the escrow company, and the relevant providers. If those records match what your grandson preserved, the timeline becomes very strong." The technician pointed to the screen. "We already have enough information to request preservation orders, so the providers do not purge logs while warrants and subpoenas are being prepared. The escrow documents identify Biscayne Horizon. The household records show repeated sessions around the same times as the suspicious transfers. The signed guarantor schedules identify Trent and Lucille as beneficial owners. Each piece supports the others." Harrison leaned back in his chair. "Between the bank records, we can subpoena the forged authorizations, the escrow trail, the pawn transactions, and these signed disclosures. We have the foundation for wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, and money laundering charges. My office can take this to a federal prosecutor today. But if recovery of the $4.2 million matters as much as the arrests, we need to move carefully." "Then arrest them today," I stated flatly. "Go to their house, put them in handcuffs, and freeze the accounts." Harrison sighed, the professional satisfaction bleeding out of his expression, replaced by the grim reality of federal bureaucracy. "It is not that simple, Josephine." I narrowed my eyes. "You have the contract. You have the logs. What exactly is the problem?" "The problem is international banking jurisdiction," Harrison explained slowly. "We have the historical data proving they moved the money. We can easily get an arrest warrant for the past crimes. But the moment we knock on Trent's door with handcuffs, his lawyers will immediately file emergency motions to halt any asset seizures. That $4.2 million is currently sitting in a decentralized offshore holding account, waiting to be cleared for the Miami real estate closing." Harrison pointed to the escrow documents on the screen. "If Trent gets spooked, if he senses law enforcement is closing in, he can execute a kill switch on those offshore accounts from a burner phone. He can bounce that money through a dozen different international jurisdictions in less than 5 minutes. We could easily put him in a federal prison, but we might never recover a single dime of your daughter's trust fund. The money would be gone forever." I felt a cold knot tighten in the pit of my stomach. Maya needed that capital. It was her future, her independence, her safety net to rebuild her life after I destroyed her abusive marriage. I was not going to let Trent burn her legacy just out of spite. "What do you need to secure the capital permanently?" I asked, keeping my voice completely devoid of the panic trying to claw its way up my throat. "I need a current session that lets us identify where the money is sitting now," Harrison said. "We are already seeking the necessary court orders. If Trent logs into the Miami escrow portal or initiates another transfer, while our cyber team is monitoring lawfully obtained records from the bank and service providers, we can match the live authentication trail to the accounts in the warrant. Once the judge signs the seizure order, the financial institutions can freeze the funds before he moves them again." Malik looked at the federal agent. "You need him to check the money while you are watching." "Exactly," Harrison confirmed. "But criminals do not just log into offshore accounts casually. They only access those highly secure portals when they are either making a massive transfer or when they are absolutely terrified that something has gone wrong." I stood up from the metal chair and walked over to the reinforced window. I looked out at the Chicago streets below. The plan required precision. It required psychological warfare. I needed to force Trent into a state of absolute panic. I needed to make him believe the money was in immediate jeopardy, compelling him to log in to verify the funds. And I needed to do it while Malik was actively routing the signal directly to the federal authorities. I turned back to face Agent Harrison. "Trent and Lucille think they just signed a multi-million-dollar partnership with my logistics firm. They think we are celebrating tomorrow night." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "You are having dinner with them." "I am having dinner at their house," I corrected him. "I am going to walk directly into the lion's den. I am going to sit at their dining room table, eat their food, and look them directly in the eyes. I will bring the finalized partnership documents. I will create a situation that forces Trent to doubt his absolute control over the Miami accounts." Harrison looked deeply concerned. "Josephine, this man is physically abusive. We have the evidence of the bruises on your daughter. If you back him into a corner inside his own home, his immediate reaction might be extremely violent. This is an incredibly dangerous scenario for you to orchestrate." I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit. "I survived building a trucking empire in the darkest corners of this city, Thomas. A cowardly man who hits his wife does not terrify me. He is a bully who hides behind his mother's silk skirts and offshore bank accounts." I looked at Malik, who was watching me with a mixture of fear and absolute awe. "Malik will be upstairs in his bedroom during the dinner. He will maintain the active network connection to your cyber team. He will send me a silent alert the precise second Trent logs into the portal." Harrison nodded slowly, recognizing that he could not stop me. "We will have tactical units stationed in unmarked vans exactly 2 blocks away from the house. We will monitor the live ping. The moment the connection is established and the funds are seized, we will wait for your signal to breach the property. Do not engage him physically, Josephine. You just deliver the psychological blow, force him online, and let us handle the rest." "I will do exactly what is necessary to protect my daughter," I replied coldly. I left the federal building and got back into my waiting car. Malik sat silently beside me, his hands resting on his knees. We did not speak during the drive back to the estate. We both knew the gravity of the situation we were about to walk into. The digital evidence was safely in federal custody. The legal trap was locked and loaded. The tactical teams were fully briefed and prepared to mobilize. When we arrived back at my house, I walked directly into my private study. I picked up my phone and dialed Trent's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with that same unearned, arrogant confidence. Mama Joe Trent boomed through the speaker. I was just reviewing the initial construction proposals for the warehouse district. We are going to break ground ahead of schedule. That is wonderful news, Trent, I said, forcing a warm, enthusiastic tone into my voice. I am so thrilled to have a strong managing partner handling the heavy lifting. In fact, I think we should officially celebrate the new venture. I would love to come over for dinner tomorrow night. Just a quiet family gathering to toast to our shared success. I could hear the greedy satisfaction radiating through the phone line. Of course, Mama Joe. Lucille is actually planning a beautiful prime rib dinner for tomorrow evening. It will be the perfect occasion to formalize everything. Bring the final addendums with you. I will bring everything we need to finalize the transition, I promised him. I will see you tomorrow at 7. I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on my desk. I looked at the framed photograph of Maya sitting on my bookshelf, taken long before the dark bruises and the heavy cashmere sweaters became her daily reality. She was smiling, her eyes bright with a future that had been violently stolen from her. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the thick stack of fake partnership documents. I needed to carefully modify the final page. I needed to insert a highly specific, undeniable reference to the Miami Shell Company. It had to be subtle enough that Trent would not notice it immediately, but blatant enough that when I forced him to read it out loud, the absolute terror would completely override his rational thought process. He thought tomorrow night was going to be a victory lap. He thought he had successfully manipulated an aging widow out of her hard-earned empire. He had absolutely no idea that I had just spent the entire morning handing his financial execution orders directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I set the documents inside my leather purse. The board was set. The pieces were moving into their final positions. Tomorrow night, I would sit at his dining room table. I would watch him drink his expensive wine, and then I would systematically burn his entire existence to the ground. Let the dinner begin. The dinner itself had required one final adjustment. Harrison did not want me provoking Trent into violence, and neither did I. The plan was only to make him anxious enough about the Miami money to check it. I carried an addendum that referred to Biscayne Horizon as a disclosed affiliated entity and required updated proof of funds before the warehouse financing could proceed. To Trent, the reference would look like a compliance problem. To Maya, if she happened to read it, the familiar trust information might raise questions. I did not anticipate how quickly those two risks would collide. At 7 o'clock, I arrived at the suburban house with the papers in my purse and a bottle of wine in my hand. Lucille greeted me as though she were hosting a victory dinner. Maya looked pale. Malik met my eyes only once before going upstairs after the main course. I knew Harrison's team was nearby, but no van was visible from the windows. That was deliberate. Trent spent the first hour talking about the warehouse district. He described contractors he had not been authorized to hire and profits that did not exist. He called himself managing partner twice. I nodded, asked mild questions, and let his confidence expand until caution seemed insulting to him. When I finally placed the addendum beside his plate, I said the lender needed one last verification tied to the collateral schedule. Trent scanned the first page, saw Biscayne Horizon, and went very still. Then he smiled too quickly. "Routine compliance," I said. "Of course," he answered. He signed one initial box. A moment later, his left hand disappeared beneath the table. The glow of his phone reflected faintly against his shirt cuff. He was checking the account. My own phone vibrated once inside my purse. That was Malik's signal. I did not touch it. The freeze was no longer my decision to make. Outside the house, investigators were confirming what they needed. Inside, the paper remained on the table. Then Maya read it. The next evening, the story caught up with the moment I had shown you at the beginning. Dinner had unfolded exactly as Trent expected for almost an hour. He drank my bourbon, praised the imaginary warehouse project, and spoke about the future as if sterling freight were already his. Lucille wore Maya's diamond tennis bracelet without the slightest embarrassment. Malik ate quickly, complained that he had homework, and went upstairs, where he could keep his phone open to the secure instructions Harrison's team had given him. I waited until dessert plates were cleared before taking the addendum from my purse. The page did not contain a secret power to seize anyone's assets. It contained something more dangerous to Trent, the name Biscayne Horizon, the account suffix he had been using, and language requiring final verification of the funds supporting the supposed partnership. I slid the document toward him. His pride did the rest. He initialed the first box, opened his phone beneath the edge of the table when he thought I was not looking, and checked the Miami account to make sure the money was still where he expected it to be. Upstairs, Malik saw the household connection appear and sent the prearranged alert. Outside, federal agents and bank investigators already operating under court authority matched the session to the accounts identified in their warrants. Only then did Maya lean over the page. Her eyes moved from Biscayne Horizon to the familiar account reference tied to her trust. Her posture changed. She had spent most of the evening shrinking into her chair. Now she sat forward. Maya shifted her weight in the heavy dining chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the pristine hardwood floor. "Trent," she said, her voice starting out as a fragile, breathless whisper before gaining an unexpected resonant strength. "Trent, wait a moment. Look at this specific clause right here on the bottom margin. It explicitly grants full access and permanent audit permissions to the Miami holding accounts. What Miami accounts are they talking about in this commercial warehouse contract? We do not own any commercial or residential property in the state of Florida." The ambient temperature in the dining room seemed to plummet instantly, replacing the warm July air with a freezing, suffocating tension. Trent froze completely, his gold fountain pen suspended perfectly still in the air above the final sheet of paper. He had been halfway through signing his initials on the secondary liability waiver. The smug, arrogant grin he had been wearing all evening melted right off his face, replaced by a mask of sheer panic. A deep, ugly red flush began to creep rapidly up his neck, staining his collar and spreading across his jawline. A visible bead of sweat formed at his temple and rolled down the side of his face. He slowly lowered the pen to the table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the wood. Lucille abruptly stopped chewing her food, her heavy silver fork clattering loudly against her fine china plate. Her eyes darted frantically between my daughter, the exposed legal document, and my completely unreadable stoic expression. She reached up and touched the stolen diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, a nervous, involuntary tick. "Shut up!" Maya. Trent hissed his tone, dropping into a dangerous low gravel that vibrated across the surface of the mahogany table. "You do not have the slightest idea what you are talking about right now. This is standard commercial corporate jargon required for the massive warehouse acquisition your mother is funding. It is boilerplate text for out-of-state asset protection. Mind your own business and sit back down in your chair before you embarrass us both in front of your mother." But Maya found a hidden reserve of absolute unyielding strength deep within herself. She did not retreat into the thick folds of her heavy cashmere cardigan. She did not lower her eyes to the floor in submission. She pointed her trembling finger directly at the paper again, pressing her manicured nail into the wood table underneath with fierce determination. "No, look right here at this specific paragraph," she insisted, her voice rising in volume and clarity. "It clearly lists a newly incorporated shell company based out of Delaware. It explicitly lists my personal trust fund routing number as the primary capital funding source for this entity. Trent, what exactly are you doing with my trust fund money?" The absolute horrifying secret was laid completely bare under the bright, unforgiving glow of the crystal dining chandelier. Trent realized in a fraction of a split second that his entire elaborate money laundering operation was utterly exposed to the one person he was actively trying to bankrupt. The millions of dollars he and his mother were systematically siphoning from my daughter's accounts to purchase that luxury penthouse condo in Miami were printed in undeniable black and white ink right on his own dining room table. He knew I had brought the documents. He knew I had forced him to sign them. The heavy bourbon he had been drinking all night, the sudden suffocating panic of absolute discovery, and his desperate need for violent physical control over the women in his life took over his brain completely. He did not attempt to snatch the papers back. He did not even glance in my direction to gauge my reaction. He simply pivoted aggressively on his heels, raised his right hand high into the air, and backhanded Maya viciously across the left side of her face. The brutal kinetic force of the physical blow literally lifted my daughter out of her heavy dining chair. She flew backward through the air, her feet leaving the hardwood floor entirely. Her shoulder and the side of her head crashed violently into the antique glass of the heirloom china cabinet, standing against the far wall of the dining room. The fragile glass panes shuddered violently and cracked with a terrifying explosive noise, sending sharp shards raining down around her as she crumpled down onto the floorboards. She curled instantly into a defensive ball, her knees pulling up to her chest, her hands flying instantly to her bleeding split lip. Drops of bright red blood splattered onto her pristine white cashmere sweater. For a fraction of a second, a dead, horrifying silence descended upon the entire room. The only sound was the jagged noise of Maya gasping for ragged, terrified breaths on the floorboards and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then Lucille calmly picked up her embroidered linen napkin from her lap. She meticulously dabbed the corners of her mouth, smoothing her expensive red lipstick with absolute precision. She set down her crystal wine glass with a soft, deliberate clink against the table. She looked down at my bleeding, trembling daughter on the floor with an expression of utter disgust, then looked directly into my eyes across the prime rib roast. She raised her hands, the stolen diamonds catching the light, and began to clap them together in a slow, steady, incredibly mocking rhythm. "That is exactly how women learn their proper place," Lucille stated, her voice dripping with venomous, aristocratic satisfaction. She should have learned a very long time ago not to ever question the men who graciously provide for her and take care of her. You severely spoiled her, Josephine. You raised her to think she had a voice in complex male affairs and financial matters that are far beyond her comprehension. But Trent is finally fixing your mistakes and teaching her some basic respect for her husband. In another time, the South Side girl in me might have crossed that table before I thought about consequences. Instead, I looked at Maya on the floor and remembered every step that had brought us there. Malik was upstairs away from the violence with instructions to contact Harrison if Trent accessed the financial portal. 10 minutes earlier, he had sent the silent alert. Federal investigators had already confirmed the live session through records available to them under court orders, and the financial institutions had begun executing the freeze. The money was no longer something Trent could move with a swipe of his thumb. My job now was simpler: protect my daughter and do nothing that would interfere with the people coming through that door. I stood up from my chair with absolute terrifying slowness. I meticulously smoothed the front lapels of my tailored business suit, ensuring not a single crease showed my internal fury. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I looked at Lucille, watching her smug, victorious smile begin to falter slightly at my complete lack of emotional reaction or panic. Then I shifted my icy gaze to Trent, who was standing aggressively over his wife, rubbing his bruised knuckles and breathing in heavy, ragged, adrenaline-fueled gasps. I reached my right hand calmly into my leather designer purse sitting on the chair beside me. I pulled out my mobile phone and firmly pressed the single speed dial number I had programmed earlier that morning at the federal building. The encrypted call connected instantly on the very first ring. "It is Josephine," I said into the receiver, keeping my voice frigid, authoritative, and entirely steady. "The financial trap is firmly closed. The suspect has physically struck the victim. Execute the warrants immediately, and send the medical paramedics to the dining room for my daughter." I ended the active call and slid the mobile device smoothly back into my coat pocket, clasping my hands in front of me. Trent let out a loud, barking, arrogant laugh, though his eyes darted nervously toward the large front bay windows facing the dark street. "Who the hell do you think you are calling, old woman? You are standing inside my personal house. Do you honestly think the local Chicago police officers care about a minor family domestic dispute? Do you think they are going to arrest a prominent local businessman because my clumsy wife tripped over her own feet and fell into a glass cabinet? I golf with the precinct captain every single Sunday morning at the country club. I donate heavily to the municipal election funds. You are making an absolute fool of yourself, and when I am done teaching her a lesson, I am going to throw you out into the street." I walked slowly around the edge of the dining table, ignoring his unhinged ranting completely. I knelt down on the hardwood floor beside Maya, carefully avoiding the scattered shards of broken glass. I pulled a clean, monogrammed silk handkerchief from my pocket and gently pressed it against her bleeding, swollen lip, offering her a silent look of absolute maternal protection. I stood back up to my full height and looked directly back at Trent, letting him finally see the absolute, unfiltered destruction burning brightly behind my eyes. "I did not call the local police department, Trent," I replied, my words slicing cleanly and lethally through the heavy, bourbon-soaked air of the formal dining room. "I called the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Trent's face contorted into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated rage and sudden dawning comprehension. He realized the sheer scope of the trap I had just triggered. He took a heavy, threatening step toward me, his hands curling into tight, violent fists, ready to unleash his anger on the woman who had just permanently dismantled his entire life. He opened his mouth to scream another threat, raising his arm to strike me just as brutally as he had struck my daughter. He never finished the forward movement. The heavy, synchronized, terrifying sound of dozens of armored tactical boots thundering up the concrete steps of the front porch echoed violently through the walls of the house, stopping him completely dead in his tracks. The heavy oak double doors of the foyer did not merely open. They exploded inward with a deafening crash of splintering wood and shearing metal hinges. The sheer kinetic force of the breach sent a shockwave through the formal dining room, rattling the crystal goblets on the table and vibrating up through the soles of my shoes. Trent stumbled backward instantly. His polished leather shoes lost their grip on the hardwood floor, causing his arms to flail wildly in the air as his previous violent bravado completely evaporated. 12 tactical officers flooded the entry hallway in perfect synchronization. Their heavy black body armor created a stark, jarring contrast against the cream-colored wainscoting and the delicate floral wallpaper Maya had picked out just last spring. The beams of their tactical flashlights swept rapidly across the room, cutting through the ambient light of the crystal chandelier. They fanned out with absolute precision, securing all the exits and blocking the hallway leading toward the kitchen. Special Agent Thomas Harrison walked calmly through the shattered entryway, stepping carefully over the ruined remnants of the front door. He bypassed the tactical perimeter and stepped directly into the center of the dining room. His federal badge was clearly visible on his belt. The flashing red and blue strobe lights from the dozen cruiser vehicles parked on the street outside painted the walls of the dining room in frantic, pulsing colors. Harrison did not raise his voice, but his tone carried enough authority to stop every argument in the room. "Trenton Hayes and Lucille Hayes," he announced, "you are being taken into federal custody, pursuant to warrants, involving wire fraud, bank fraud, identity-related offenses, and conspiracy to launder money." Local officers and paramedics are also responding to the assault that just occurred in this residence. 2 heavily armored agents flanked Trent immediately. They grabbed him by the shoulders and forced him face down onto his own custom Persian rug. The cold, sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed loudly in the quiet room. Trent did not attempt to fight back or leverage his country club connections. He instantly began to weep. Loud, ugly, desperate sobs vibrated against the floorboards as the reality of his situation crushed him. Lucille jumped up from her chair so fast that it tipped over backward. The heavy mahogany wood slammed into the wall, scraping the paint. Her hands flew nervously to her neck, her fingers clutching tightly at the stolen pearls resting there. "You cannot possibly do this to us," she shrieked, her voice shrill and completely devoid of its previous aristocratic smoothness. "We are wealthy citizens. We own highly valuable commercial properties in Miami. I know the mayor personally, and I will sue this entire federal department into absolute bankruptcy." I walked slowly around the edge of the dining table, my heels clicking deliberately, exactly 12 inches from Lucille's face. I looked pointedly at the stolen diamond tennis bracelet shaking violently on her wrist, then met her terrified, wide eyes. "You do not own the future you were planning to buy with Maya's money, Lucille," I said quietly. "That commercial agreement you and your son signed was not the free ride you thought it was. You both certified that Biscayne Horizon belonged to you. You identified the accounts behind it. You authorized due diligence verification. Federal investigators used those admissions together with bank records and a judge's warrants to trace the money you tried to hide." Lucille's jaw dropped open. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She looked frantically down at Trent, who was currently pressing his face into the carpet and pleading nonsensically with the arresting officers. Trent twisted his neck painfully to look up at the dining table. "Maya," he begged, fresh tears streaming down his face and mixing with the dust on the floor. "Maya, please tell them to stop. Tell them it was just a simple misunderstanding about the trust fund routing numbers. Tell them I was just trying to manage our long-term investments. I am your husband. You have to help me right now." 2 municipal paramedics arrived at the front door, pushing their way past the federal agents with a green medical kit. They rushed quickly toward Maya, who was still leaning heavily against the broken china cabinet. She gently waved them off for a brief moment. She braced her hand against the unbroken side of the wooden frame and pulled herself up to her full, towering height. She grabbed a white cloth napkin from the table and pressed it firmly against her bleeding lip. She looked down at the man who had terrorized her for years in the privacy of their own home. She did not cry. "I do not know you," Maya said. Her voice was incredibly quiet, but it held a cold, absolute finality that sealed his fate forever. The federal agents hauled Trent aggressively to his feet. They marched him out through the shattered front door, his expensive suit dragging against the splinters of the ruined entryway. Another female agent grabbed Lucille firmly by the upper arm, securing her wrists behind her back in a separate pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Lucille tried to struggle, her designer heels slipping dangerously on the debris scattered across the floor, but the agent marched her out into the blinding glare of the police lights waiting in the street. Agent Harrison motioned for his cyber forensics team to enter the residence. 5 technicians carrying empty plastic evidence bins swarmed into the house. They began systematically dismantling Trent's home office, bagging his commercial-grade router, his laptops, and his mobile devices. Harrison dispatched another team directly to the guest house in the backyard to secure Lucille's tablet and any remaining financial ledgers hidden among her stolen antique furniture. Malik came slowly down the staircase once an agent told him the room was secure. He carried his closed laptop under one arm. The bravado he sometimes used when discussing computers was gone. He saw the broken glass, the blood on the napkin, and his mother standing beside the paramedics. He set the laptop on a chair and wrapped both arms around Maya. She held him so tightly that for several seconds neither of them moved. I stepped over to Agent Harrison while the forensic team cataloged the devices. The offshore transfer was fully intercepted. He confirmed reading from his secure tablet. The institution served with the seizure order froze the $4.2 million before it could clear into the Miami purchase. The funds will remain in federal custody until the court completes the asset recovery process, but the money is no longer under Trent's control. I nodded, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 3 months finally lift from my shoulders. The tactical units began clearing out of the dining room, leaving us alone with the paramedics, who were now gently cleaning Maya's lip and checking her for a concussion. I watched my daughter smile faintly at a joke Malik whispered in her ear. The fear that had clouded her eyes for months was entirely gone, replaced by a profound exhaustion-tinged relief. The flashing lights from the police cruisers began to pull away from the curb one by one, carrying Trent and Lucille toward a federal holding facility where their stolen money could no longer protect them. I walked over to the dining table, picked up my leather purse, and placed a comforting hand on Malik's shoulder. We were going to pack their bags and drive straight to my estate on Lake Michigan. This house was nothing more than a crime scene now, a temporary monument to a greedy man who severely miscalculated the strength of the women he tried to break. 3 days later, I walked through the heavily fortified double doors of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago. The air inside the federal holding facility was stale, smelling strongly of industrial bleach and institutional despair. I checked my designer coat with the front desk guard and followed a silent deputy down a long fluorescent-lit corridor. Agent Harrison had arranged the visitation parameters exactly as I had requested. Trent and Lucille were currently being held in completely separate interrogation blocks on opposite sides of the building. Harrison informed me that morning that they were already desperately turning on each other, each attempting to secure a favorable plea deal by throwing the other directly under the federal bus. The deputy stopped outside a reinforced steel door and swiped his keycard. The heavy locking mechanism disengaged with a loud, hollow clack. I stepped into the small, windowless visitation room. Trent was sitting at the center of a bolted metal table wearing a wrinkled, oversized orange jumpsuit that swallowed his previously imposing frame. The unearned arrogance that usually radiated from him was entirely gone. He looked small, pathetic, and completely broken. Dark, heavy bags hung under his eyes, and his hands shook violently as he rested them on the table. He looked up when I entered, his eyes widening in sheer desperation. "Mama Joe," he croaked, his voice cracking painfully. "Thank God you came. You have to talk to Maya for me. You have to explain to her that this was all a massive mistake." I pulled out the metal chair across from him and sat down smoothly, placing my leather briefcase on the table between us. I did not say a word. I simply watched him squirm under the intense, unforgiving weight of my silence. It was my mother. Trent continued leaning forward aggressively, tears spilling out of his bloodshot eyes. Lucille manipulated me into the entire scheme. She kept whispering in my ear that Maya was going to leave me, that I needed to secure my own financial future before she took everything. I never wanted to steal the money. I just wanted to protect my family. You have to believe me. I opened my briefcase and slid a copy of the papers Maya's family law attorney had filed that morning across the table. A petition for dissolution of marriage, a request for an emergency order of protection, and a motion asking the court to preserve marital assets and give Maya temporary decision-making authority while Trent remained in custody. None of it required his consent. The purpose of the visit was not to bargain away his rights in a locked room. I wanted him to understand that Maya had finally made the decision he had spent years trying to prevent. Trent stared at the documents. For the first time since I entered, his tears stopped. The federal case frightened him, but the divorce papers struck somewhere deeper. They told him that the private system of control he had built inside his home was over. "You hit my daughter in front of witnesses," I said. "Investigators say the financial records show millions moving through accounts tied to you and your mother. Maya is no longer asking your permission to see a lawyer control her own money or decide where she and Malik will live. Whatever happens in the criminal case, that part is finished. I did not play secret recordings or threaten him with evidence. Harrison had warned me not to turn a family visit into an interrogation, and Maya's attorney had warned me not to create unnecessary disputes over coercion. I simply let the filed papers sit between us." Trent looked from the petition to me. He began blaming Lucille again, then blaming alcohol, then stress, then Maya for questioning him at dinner. Each explanation collapsed under the next. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he still believed responsibility was something that happened to other people. I listened until he ran out of excuses. Then I closed my briefcase. "You do not need to sign anything for Maya to leave you," I told him. "You will be served through your attorney. If you want to contest custody, property, or support, you can do it in court. That is where facts belong now." The steel door opened before Trent could answer. A short, balding man in a gray suit entered carrying a worn leather briefcase. His expression told me immediately that he had been moving quickly since the arrests. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, "I am Arthur Brooks, Mr. Hayes's defense counsel. This interview is over." He stepped beside Trent rather than between us, then gathered the papers without touching my briefcase. "My client will respond to the family filing through counsel." I stood and buttoned my coat. "That is exactly what I expect," I said. Arthur's tone hardened. "We will also challenge the financial evidence, the manner in which the household records were collected, and any attempt to turn a business contract into a shortcut around constitutional protections. If the government built this case on your grandson's computer, we will find out." That was the first sensible thing anyone on Trent's side had said in days. I met Arthur's eyes. "Then you should ask the bank for its authentication records, the escrow company for its ownership files, the jewelers for their pawn receipts, and your client, why his signature appears beneath Biscayne Horizon on a contract he was desperate to profit from." Malik's files led investigators to questions. Your client supplied many of the answers himself. Arthur did not smile. Neither did I. The case was finally leaving the dining room and entering the place where boasting, intimidation, and family mythology mattered less than documents. I walked out of the visitation room knowing the next battle would be slower than the raid, less dramatic than a shattered front door, and far more important. The first family court hearing took place 4 days after my visit with Trent. Maya had not wanted me to sit beside her at counsel table, and I respected that. For too long, everyone in her life had treated decisions about her as if they belonged to somebody else. Trent had told her what she could wear, where she could go, which statements she was allowed to see, and how much money she could spend. Lucille had entered her home and started rearranging rooms, firing employees, and wearing jewelry that was not hers. Even my protection, however well-intended, could become another form of control if I was not careful. So I sat in the second row with Malik and let my daughter walk to the front of the courtroom on her own. She wore a navy suit with the sleeves ending at her wrists. For the first time in months, there was no heavy cardigan hiding her arms. The bruises had faded from purple to yellow, and the swelling around her mouth from the dinner had mostly disappeared. What had not disappeared was the tension in her shoulders whenever the side door opened. Trent was still in federal custody, so he appeared by secure video with Arthur seated in the courtroom. Lucille had separate counsel. The criminal allegations were not being tried there. The judge made that clear before anyone could turn the hearing into theater. The questions were narrower. Where would Maya and Malik live? Who could contact them? Who would control the accounts used for ordinary household expenses? What needed to be preserved until the divorce and criminal cases were resolved? Arthur tried to sound measured. He said Trent loved his family. He said the marriage had been under unusual financial stress. He said a single incident at dinner should not erase nearly 2 decades of marriage. Then he suggested that Maya had been influenced by me, that my wealth gave me the ability to turn a domestic dispute into a federal spectacle, and that I had always disapproved of my son-in-law. Maya's attorney did not argue with his adjectives. She handed the judge the police photographs from the dinner the paramedics report. The earlier photographs my private investigator had taken after I asked him to document the missing jewelry, and a sworn statement from Maya describing other incidents she had never reported. The judge read in silence. Then Maya was asked a simple question. Did she feel safe having direct contact with Trent? No, she said. Arthur stood. Your Honor, my client has never been convicted of domestic violence. The judge looked over the top of the file. That is not the question before me today. Arthur sat down. When the judge asked Maya whether she wanted to remain in the suburban house, my daughter surprised me. No, she said. I do not want my son sleeping in the room where he listened for footsteps in the hallway. I do not want to walk past that dining room every morning. I want access to my clothes, my personal records, and the items that belong to me, but I do not want the house. The judge authorized a supervised retrieval of personal property, prohibited Trent from contacting Maya or Malik outside communication through counsel, and entered a temporary order giving Maya control of her own day-to-day accounts. The larger assets would remain frozen or preserved while ownership was sorted out. Malik at 16 would stay with Maya at my Lake Michigan estate until a later hearing. The judge also ordered that neither parent use Malik as a messenger investigator or witness collector. I felt Malik shift beside me when those words were spoken. He knew they were partly about him. Outside the courtroom, Arthur caught up with us. He did not threaten me this time. He asked whether Maya would agree to a private settlement of the divorce if Trent waived any claim to her separate trust and accepted limited contact with Malik. Maya answered before I could. You can send the proposal to my lawyer, she said. Arthur looked at me as though he expected me to overrule her. I said nothing. That silence mattered. Maya had spent years learning that Trent's moods determined the temperature of every room. Freedom was not simply getting him arrested. It was rebuilding the reflex that allowed her to answer a question without first looking at someone else's face for permission. On the courthouse steps, Malik reached for her hand. She took it, and the two of them walked ahead of me toward the car. For the first time since the barbecue, I did not feel like I was dragging my daughter out of danger. I felt like I was following her. While the family case moved in public, the federal investigation became quieter. That was where Arthur intended to attack. 2 days after the protective order, Harrison asked Malik and me to return to the federal building. This time, Maya came with us. The conference room looked exactly as it had before the raid, but the evidence had changed. On the first visit, we had brought leads. Now the government had records from institutions that did not care about our family arguments. The bank's authentication logs showed repeated access to Maya's trust administration portal from a device registered to Trent. Several transactions had used a digital certificate copied from a computer in Maya's home office. The service provider's records showed that the certificate had been exported to a second machine. A camera at one branch showed Trent attempting to resolve a security hold on an account linked to Biscayne Horizon. The Miami Escrow Company had a beneficial ownership form naming Trent and Lucille. The Delaware Formation Service had retained payment information tied to one of Lucille's cards. The cryptocurrency exchanges that touched part of the funds had preserved identity verification documents. None of those facts depended on Malik's laptop. Harrison placed 2 stacks of paper on the table. The smaller stack contained records Malik had preserved at home. The larger stack contained independent records obtained through subpoenas, warrants, and preservation orders. This, Harrison said, tapping the larger pile, is why I told you not to touch anything else after the first night. Your household logs gave us dates to examine. They helped us move quickly. But the case cannot rest on a teenager's interpretation of network traffic, and now it does not. Malik looked relieved rather than disappointed. I realized he had been carrying a fear. He never said out loud that one mistake in the way he had collected information might somehow free Trent or cost Maya the money. Harrison seemed to understand it too. You did the right thing when you stopped, he told him. Evidence is strongest when other sources can confirm it. Maya sat with her hands folded. She asked to see the forged authorization forms. Harrison hesitated, then slid copies toward her. She studied her own signature reproduced again and again. On some pages, Trent had used a version of her signature from old tax documents. On others, the shape was close but rushed. Each one was an attempt to make her disappear from a decision involving her own property. I kept waiting for Maya to cry. Instead, she became precise. "That transfer on August 2nd could not have been me," she said. "Malik and I were at Northwestern that afternoon for his summer program interview. There will be parking records. This one was submitted at 11:23 at night. Trent told me the bank site was down that evening, and this address is wrong. I stopped using that mailing address 3 years ago." Harrison wrote each detail down. Then Maya pointed to a transfer I had not noticed. "What is this one? The amount was smaller than the others, $48,000. It went to a jewelry brokerage before being split into 2 accounts. Harrison said investigators believed it was connected to pieces Lucille had pawned or sold." Maya's expression changed. The missing jewelry had always been easier for her to minimize than the stolen trust money. She could call a necklace an object. She could tell herself a watch could be replaced. But I knew those pieces carried memory. The emerald brooch had belonged to Elias before I gave it to Maya on her wedding day. He had spent weeks choosing it during one of our rare vacations, worried that green would be too bold. The value on an insurance form could never explain why its absence hurt. "Can we get them back?" Maya asked. "Some," Harrison said. "We have already placed holds on several pieces located through the broker records. Others may have been resold. Asset recovery is slow, but we are tracing them." Maya nodded once. "Do it." That afternoon, Harrison told us Arthur had filed motions challenging the search of the home, the seizure of devices, and the use of records derived from Malik's material. That was his job. He was not wrong to test whether investigators had followed the rules. The strength of the case would not be measured by how angry we were, but by whether it survived those tests. I had spent most of my life believing preparation meant anticipating what an opponent would do. The federal case taught me a slightly different lesson. Preparation also meant building a case that did not collapse if one piece was removed. Arthur could attack Malik's logs. The bank records remained. He could attack the contract. The escrow forms remained. He could argue that Lucille owned Biscayne Horizon. Trent's branch visit device history and messages remained. He could say the dinner had been a moment of stress. Maya's earlier bruises, her sworn statement, and Trent's pattern of control remained relevant to the family court. One by one, the exits were closing. Not because I had written a magical clause into 400 pages, but because Trent and Lucille had repeated the same mistake greedy people often make. They believed every act existed alone. A pawn receipt here, a deleted statement there, a shell company in another state, a lodging after midnight, a forged signature, a lie at dinner. Each seemed small enough to explain. Together they became a map. Lucille's first serious attempt to save herself came a week later. Harrison called me early in the morning and asked whether I had ever given her permission to sell Maya's jewelry. The question was so absurd I almost laughed, but his tone stopped me. Lucille was claiming the pieces were gifts. According to the statement she gave through counsel, Maya had supposedly offered her several heirlooms during a period when the two women were especially close. Lucille said the family had misunderstood her generosity and that the pawn transactions were ordinary efforts to convert gifts into cash. She also claimed that Trent had handled all financial matters involving Biscayne Horizon and that she had signed the warehouse documents because she trusted her son. The strategy was obvious. Trent was blaming Lucille for manipulating him. Lucille was blaming Trent for the money and Maya for the jewelry. The partnership that had looked so strong across the dining table was dissolving under fluorescent lights. I told Harrison that I had never given Lucille a single piece of Maya's jewelry and that several items had originally belonged to me. More importantly, Maya could speak for herself. Maya did. She spent nearly 3 hours with investigators, describing when each piece had disappeared and the explanations she had invented because admitting the truth felt more frightening. The emerald brooch had vanished after Lucille borrowed Maya's dressing room before a charity dinner. The sapphire earrings disappeared after Lucille insisted on helping organize a closet. The Cartier watch was gone after a weekend when Maya and Malik stayed with me. None had been gifts. Then came the bracelet Lucille had worn at the final dinner. The federal evidence photographs showed it clearly on her wrist, while agents placed her in handcuffs. Maya produced the birthday card I had given her with the bracelet years earlier and the insurance schedule listing its serial number. That one photograph destroyed the idea that every missing piece had been innocently transferred. The pawnbroker's records were worse for Lucille. She had signed forms identifying herself as the owner and provided identification for each sale. Security footage showed her entering alone. Messages recovered from her tablet included complaints to Trent about low offers and instructions to use cash for expenses that would not appear on Maya's statements. The most damaging message was not dramatic. It was 7 words long. Sell the green pin before she notices. Harrison showed it to me on a printed page. I stared at the sentence longer than I expected. Elias had called that brooch the green pin because he never remembered the difference between a brooch and a pin. For 30 years, the phrase had made me smile. Seeing it in Lucille's message felt like watching someone put a price tag on a private memory. Maya touched my arm. "Mom," she said, "we do not need the brooch back to remember Dad." I knew that. Still, I wanted it. 3 weeks later, an evidence officer called to say the brooch had been located in the inventory of a private estate dealer who had not yet resold it. It would remain in custody while the case was pending, but it was safe. Several other pieces were recovered too. Some were not. The missing items would be included in restitution calculations if the government could prove the losses. Lucille's lawyers soon stopped describing the jewelry as gifts. They shifted to a new explanation: financial desperation. She had debt. She had no stable home. She had depended on Trent. She had convinced herself that Maya had more than enough. I could understand desperation without confusing it with permission. For years, Lucille had spoken as though wealth proved moral superiority. She criticized my South Side childhood, called my company New Money, and treated the people who cleaned her rooms as invisible. Once the money disappeared, she wanted poverty to become an excuse. I had been poor. I knew what it was to choose between fuel for a truck and groceries for a week. Desperation could explain why a person felt tempted. It did not erase the choice to steal a dead man's gift from his daughter and then wear another stolen bracelet to dinner. Maya, however, refused to spend her energy hating Lucille. When I asked how she could be so calm, she answered with a sentence I carried for months. "Because if I make my healing depend on her suffering, she still controls part of my life." That was the moment I realized Maya had never been soft. I had mistaken gentleness for weakness, because I came from a world where survival often required sharp edges. Trent had made the same mistake, only crueler. He believed kindness was a resource he could consume without limit. He had finally reached the limit. The asset recovery hearing was less cinematic than the raid, and more important than almost anything that came before it. There were no battering rams, no flashing lights, no expensive glasses breaking on hardwood. There were bankers, lawyers, account schedules, and a judge who stopped anyone who tried to make a speech instead of answering a question. The government sought continued restraint of the funds traced to Maya's trust, while the criminal case proceeded. Arthur argued that some money in the Biscayne Horizon structure came from legitimate sources belonging to Trent. Lucille's attorney made a similar claim about her contribution. Maya's attorney did not demand that every disputed dollar be handed to her immediately. She asked for the trust principal clearly traceable to unauthorized transfers to remain protected from dissipation and for the Miami purchase to stay frozen. The escrow company had already suspended the closing. The penthouse Trent and Lucille planned to buy with Maya's money was no longer a symbol of escape. It was a file number. An accountant retained by the government walked through the flow of funds. The original trust distributions entered domestic accounts. Portions moved to intermediary accounts. Some traveled through virtual currency platforms. The money then converged in accounts connected to Biscayne Horizon before being positioned for the real estate closing. Because the funds had been mixed with other money, tracing required more than simply matching one transfer to another. But the timing amounts, account ownership, and communications created a detailed path. Arthur cross-examined hard. He pointed out that not every dollar could be followed in a straight line. He emphasized gaps. He questioned whether some transfers had been authorized verbally. He asked why Maya had not complained earlier if millions were disappearing. I watched Maya's face when he asked that. Her attorney objected to the implication, but Maya later told me the question hurt, because it sounded like every question Trent used to ask at home. If something was wrong, why had she not noticed? If she was afraid, why had she stayed? If she did not approve, why had she signed anything at all? The answer was not simple. Abuse had not arrived at her front door wearing a label. It began with small permissions. Trent offered to handle bills because Maya was busy. He suggested combining access because married people should trust each other. He complained that questions made him feel accused. He turned financial conversations into emotional tests. When she pushed back, he sulked, then shouted, then apologized. By the time she understood the pattern, she was spending more energy preventing explosions than auditing statements. The judge did not need a lesson in their marriage to rule on the money. The financial records were enough to continue the freeze. The court also approved a process for the trust administrator to restore access to undisputed funds for Maya's living expenses and legal needs, while the traced $4.2 million remained under restraint pending final restitution and forfeiture decisions. That distinction mattered. Maya was not receiving a dramatic suitcase of cash. She was regaining control through orders, account corrections, and layers of review. After the hearing, Marcus Vance met us at the bank. He looked older than he had during our first call. He apologized to Maya for the fact that suspicious activity had progressed as far as it did. She listened, then asked him to explain every safeguard on the new account structure. Marcus described new authentication requirements, independent transaction alerts limits on delegated authority, and procedures requiring direct confirmation from Maya for significant movements. He offered to copy me on alerts. Maya said no. Marcus glanced at me. I nodded. No was the right answer. The money was hers. If she wanted my advice, she could ask. Protection that never returns control is only a more comfortable cage. Before we left, Marcus handed Maya a folder containing corrected statements and a written timeline of the bank's remediation. She held it against her chest as we walked through the lobby. "Do you want me to review that with you tonight?" I asked. She smiled. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I want to eat dinner without discussing money." So we did. At my house, Malik ordered pizza from the place he liked near the lake. We ate from cardboard boxes at the kitchen island, where weeks earlier he had opened his soaked backpack and shown me the first evidence. No prime rib, no crystal, no business contracts. Maya laughed when cheese slid off Malik's slice and landed on his shirt. It was the first ordinary dinner we had shared in months. I had spent so much time planning the moment Trent lost control that I had almost forgotten the real objective was not his downfall. It was this. Arthur's next strategy was to separate Trent the husband from Trent the financial defendant. In family court, he stopped arguing that the dinner had been a misunderstanding. The photographs were too clear. The paramedics had documented Maya's injury, and the federal agents had arrived within minutes. Instead, he tried to contain the damage. He proposed supervised contact with Malik, temporary spousal support from marital funds, and a negotiated division of the house and remaining property. He also suggested that Maya's wealth and my resources meant she had no need to seek a large share of anything Trent claimed as his. Maya's attorney answered with records, not outrage. Much of Maya's trust was separate property. The suburban house had been purchased with a combination of funds that required careful tracing. Some accounts were frozen because of the criminal case. Other assets were genuinely marital. The court would sort them category by category. There would be no simple punishment disguised as property division, and no magical transfer of everything Trent owned to Maya. That was less satisfying than the fantasy of stripping him bare with one signature, but it was real, and reality was what we needed. The harder issue was Malik. At 16, he was old enough for his wishes to matter, but the judge refused to put him in the center of an adult war. Malik met privately with a court-appointed professional and later told us only the part he wanted us to know. He had said he loved his father and was afraid of him at the same time. He said he did not want visits yet. He said he was angry that Trent had treated Maya the way he did. He also admitted that he felt guilty for spending months watching network activity instead of telling someone sooner. That last admission cut Maya deeply. She waited until they were home, then went into Malik's room and closed the door. I did not follow. An hour later, they came downstairs together. Malik's eyes were red. Maya's were too. He was a child in that house, she told me later. He thought protecting me was his job because I was not protecting myself. I will spend the rest of my life making sure he understands it was never his responsibility. The temporary custody order remained unchanged. Trent could send letters through counsel, but Malik was not required to answer. Any future contact would depend on the family court, the criminal case, and Malik's willingness. Trent responded badly. Through Arthur, he accused me of alienating his son. He claimed I had used money to influence everyone. He demanded access to Malik's school records and complained that I had turned my estate into a fortress. Arthur eventually withdrew several of those arguments after the judge reminded him that the order was designed to reduce conflict, not create new channels for it. Maya surprised Trent again by refusing to ask for restrictions broader than she needed. She did not try to change Malik's last name. She did not ask the court to erase Trent from every record. She asked for safety, decision-making authority, financial transparency, and space. Why not ask for everything I said one evening? He would have asked for everything from you. Maya looked at me across the library. Because I do not want to become him just because I can win, she said. That answer irritated the fighter in me and humbled the mother in me. I had spent my life negotiating from strength. I believed that when an opponent exposed a weakness, you used it. That instinct built sterling freight. It kept hundreds of drivers working when competitors tried to squeeze us. It protected me in rooms where courtesy was often camouflage. But family was not a freight contract. Maya did not need to crush Trent to prove she was free of him. She needed a life in which he no longer determined her choices. The divorce negotiations slowly narrowed. The house would eventually be sold unless one party could lawfully buy out the other's verified interest after the criminal restraints were resolved. Maya wanted none of the furniture Lucille had chosen. She took photographs, personal records, family albums, clothing, and the dishes Elias had given her when she married. She left the enormous dining table. When the supervised property retrieval occurred, I went with her but waited outside unless she asked for me. Federal technicians had already removed devices. The shattered front door had been boarded and replaced. The china cabinet still had a cracked pane. Maya stood in the dining room for a long time. "Do you want it?" I asked, nodding toward the cabinet. She shook her head. That belonged to the version of me who thought keeping a perfect house could keep a marriage safe. She walked upstairs. In her bedroom, she opened a drawer and found a small velvet box Lucille had missed. Inside was a plain silver bracelet Malik had bought her at a school holiday market when he was 9. It was worth almost nothing. Maya put it on immediately. That was the only piece of jewelry she wore when we left. The federal motions were argued about a month after the arrests. Arthur attacked the search of the house first. He argued that the government's response had been overly aggressive and that some digital evidence should be suppressed. The prosecutor answered with the warrants, affidavits, bank records, and the circumstances of the live domestic violence call. I was not allowed to sit there and narrate what I thought the judge should believe. I sat behind the rail and watched people who had never eaten at our family table reduce months of fear into dates, legal standards, and exhibits. That reduction was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. The judge did not accept every government argument. One category of data copied from a shared household backup was set aside pending further briefing because the question of access was complicated. Arthur looked pleased. Malik looked sick. Then the judge ruled that the core financial evidence did not depend on that material. The bank records, escrow records account, opening documents, device authentication logs obtained from providers, signed Biscayne Horizon disclosures and records seized under warrants remained available. The case did not disappear. Outside the courtroom, Malik finally exhaled. "I messed it up," he said. No, Harrison told him. "Courts decide what can be used. That is how the system is supposed to work." That single sentence did more for Malik than any speech I could have given. For weeks he had imagined justice as a perfect machine that would fail if he had touched the wrong file. Now he saw something more mature. Evidence could be challenged. Some of it could be excluded. A strong case had to survive scrutiny rather than avoid it. Arthur's second attack focused on the warehouse agreement. He argued that I had intentionally deceived Trent and Lucille about the purpose of the transaction. On that point, he was right. I had. My attorneys had warned me from the beginning that the document could not be treated as a substitute for criminal process, which was why I had corrected course with Harrison before the raid. Still, Arthur argued that the signed beneficial ownership disclosures were unreliable because they were obtained through a business opportunity I had designed as bait. The judge did not decide the entire issue in one dramatic ruling. Instead, the court allowed the government to use the documents for some purposes while leaving other questions for later proceedings. More importantly, investigators had by then obtained Biscayne Horizon's formation records and ownership certifications directly from third parties. Trent and Lucille had signed those records long before I created my fake warehouse project. When Harrison told me that I laughed for the first time in days, all that work on my 400-page trap, and they had already left their fingerprints somewhere else. Harrison almost smiled. Most complicated schemes are less complicated once you subpoena the boring paperwork. That became a running lesson through the case. Trent believed sophistication meant layers, shell companies, digital assets, offshore routes, multiple devices, and a Miami property purchased through an LLC. But every layer required a service provider, an account, a payment, an authentication step, or a person to file a document. Complexity created hiding places. It also created records. The prosecutor eventually offered Trent a plea agreement. I did not see the first draft, and I had no right to dictate it. Harrison explained only the broad outline after Maya was notified as a victim. Trent would have to admit to specific financial crimes, accept responsibility for the fraudulent transfers, and agree to restitution and forfeiture provisions tied to traced assets. The domestic battery matter would proceed through the appropriate state process and remain part of the family court record. Trent refused. Arthur advised him to consider it carefully. Trent refused again. Why, Maya asked Harrison. Because admitting the financial crimes means admitting the story he has been telling himself is false, Harrison said. Some defendants bargain over years, some bargain over identity. That sounded like Trent. He could accept being unlucky. He could accept being betrayed by Lucille. He could accept that I had tricked him. What he could not accept was the simplest version he had chosen to steal, chosen to forge, chosen to hide, and chosen to hit his wife when she asked a question. Lucille, by contrast, was already bargaining. Her lawyer approached prosecutors with information about accounts Trent had controlled and communications he had tried to delete. In return, she wanted consideration for cooperation. Trent learned about it through discovery. The next letter he sent Malik was not an apology. It was 3 pages about how Lucille had destroyed the family. Malik read half of the first page and handed it to Maya. "I do not want this," he said. Maya gave it to her attorney. That evening, Malik removed Trent's contact photo from his phone. He did not delete the number. He did not make a speech. He simply replaced the smiling family picture with a blank gray circle. Small choices, I was learning, often carried more truth than dramatic ones. By the time autumn arrived in Chicago, the criminal case had changed the rhythm of our lives. At first, every phone call felt urgent. Every unknown number made Maya stiffen. Every envelope from a law office sent Malik upstairs. Gradually, the case became part of the calendar rather than the center of the house. There were hearings, meetings, deadlines, and long stretches when nothing visible happened. Maya began working with a financial counselor and her own attorney to understand every account that had once been handled jointly. She did not hand the task to me. She made spreadsheets, asked Marcus questions, and spent Saturday mornings learning the structure of the trust. Sometimes she called me from the library with a question about a distribution or tax document. Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I told her to ask the professional responsible for it because I did not want my confidence to become another source of bad advice. One afternoon, she came into my office at Sterling Freight carrying a yellow legal pad. "I want to see how you review internal controls," she said. I leaned back in my chair. "Are you asking for a job, Noam? I am asking how you know when someone has too much authority." The question landed harder than she intended. I showed her how our payment approvals were separated, how large transfers required independent review, how no executive could both create a vendor and approve payment to it, and how our audit committee received exceptions. None of those systems existed because I believed my employees were bad people. They existed because good systems did not require blind trust. Maya wrote that down. "Blind trust is not the same as love," she said. "No," I answered. "It never was." That conversation led to one of the few changes I made at Sterling Freight because of the family case. I ordered a review of our own controls around family-connected entities and executive overrides. If I was going to lecture everyone else about evidence and accountability, I needed to examine the ways my own authority could become too concentrated. My board had trusted me for decades. Trust was not a reason to avoid safeguards. It was a reason to build them before they were needed. Malik returned to school. At first, rumors followed him because the raid had attracted local attention. He hated it. Some classmates treated him like a hacker from a movie. Others asked whether his father was going to prison. He stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria for a week. Maya wanted to transfer him. Malik said no. I have already had enough people make decisions because they think I cannot handle something, he told her. Let me try. He joined the school's robotics lab again and agreed to speak with the school counselor when the attention became too much. He also stopped running network monitoring tools at home. When I asked whether he had lost interest in computers, he shook his head. I like computers more now, he said. I just do not want everything I know how to do to become something I have to use against somebody. That was wisdom I had not possessed at 16. The recovered jewelry began returning in stages once the court-approved release of items no longer needed as physical evidence. Maya let me be present when the emerald brooch came back. It arrived in a plain evidence package tagged and photographed, looking smaller than I remembered. I held it in my palm and saw Elias at a Paris shop counter, pretending he understood jewelry while whispering to me that the salesman was charging too much. I saw Maya on her wedding day. I saw Lucille's message, "Sell the green pin before she notices." Then Maya closed my fingers around it. "Keep it," she said. "It is yours. It was yours first." I looked at her. "Do you not want it? I want what it means. I do not need to own it to have that." So I kept the brooch, but not in the wall safe. I pinned it to the inside lining of an old evening coat Elias had loved. Sometimes memory belongs closer to the heart than to an insurance schedule. The diamond bracelet from the dinner went back to Maya. She stored it away and did not wear it. The sapphire earrings were recovered and eventually given to a vault under her sole control. The Cartier watch was never found. 2 other pieces had already been resold through channels investigators could not unwind. Their appraised values were added to the restitution claim. Lucille sent Maya a letter about the jewelry. Maya did not open it. Her attorney did. It contained an apology surrounded by explanations: loneliness, debt, fear, resentment, the pressure of maintaining appearances. Maya asked for a 1-sentence summary. She says she is sorry and explains why she thinks she did it, the attorney told her. Maya nodded. That is enough. She did not need every explanation. Neither did I. Trent changed his mind about the plea agreement after the government produced one final set of records from the Miami escrow transaction. The records included a recorded compliance call made before the scheduled closing. On that call, Trent personally confirmed that Biscayne Horizon was controlled by him, and Lucille described the incoming funds as family investment capital and assured the escrow officer that all beneficial owners had authorized the transaction. Arthur listened to the call with him. 2 days later, prosecutors notified Maya that Trent wanted to reopen negotiations. The final agreement did not give me everything the angry part of me wanted. No legal outcome could. There was no sentence long enough to return the months Maya spent afraid in her own house. No restitution figure could erase the moment Malik ran through rain carrying a laptop because he believed saving his mother depended on him. Courts can punish conduct. They cannot rewind a family. Still, the agreement required Trent to say certain words in open court. He admitted that he had knowingly participated in fraudulent transfers from accounts he was not authorized to control. He admitted using false and forged authorization materials. He admitted helping conceal the origin and ownership of funds routed through Biscayne Horizon. He admitted that the money was intended in part for the Miami property. He agreed to restitution and forfeiture of assets traceable to the scheme. When the judge asked whether anyone had forced him to plead guilty, Trent said no. When the judge asked whether he understood that blaming someone else did not change the conduct he was admitting, he paused. Arthur leaned toward him. "Yes, Your Honor," Trent said. Maya sat beside her attorney. Her face did not change. I had imagined that hearing dozens of times. In some versions, Trent looked at us and broke down. In others, he begged. In the ugliest versions, I wanted him to feel publicly humiliated the way he had humiliated Maya. The real moment was quieter. He looked tired. He answered questions. The judge accepted the plea after a long, factual statement. Then marshals led him away. Outside reporters waited near the courthouse entrance because the size of the fraud and the Sterling Freight connection had attracted attention. I could have stopped. I could have given them a line about justice betrayal or the power of a mother defending her daughter. Maya asked to use another exit. We left through the side. Lucille's case resolved differently. She cooperated, but not enough to erase her own conduct. She eventually admitted participating in the concealment of funds and selling property that did not belong to her. Her agreement required restitution, forfeiture of proceeds, and truthful cooperation. The exact sentence would come later, when Maya heard she did not celebrate. "Good," she said. "Now maybe it can end." But endings in court arrive in pieces. The state domestic battery case involving Trent remained. His guilty federal plea did not decide it. His attorney negotiated separately, and Maya was consulted about conditions that mattered to her: no contact outside lawful channels, compliance with protective orders, and documentation of the assault in the record. She did not ask the prosecutor for theatrical punishment. She asked for accountability that could not be rewritten later as a misunderstanding. That mattered because Trent had spent years revising reality. He did not grab her. She bruised easily. He did not control the accounts. He handled paperwork. He did not isolate her. She preferred staying home. He did not steal. He invested. He did not hit her. She fell. Every lie depended on exhaustion. If he repeated a version often enough, Maya eventually stopped arguing because peace for one evening felt easier than proving what she already knew. The legal record changed that. Dates became fixed, transactions became exhibits, photographs had timestamps, orders had case numbers, his plea had a transcript. For someone emerging from years of manipulation, documentation was more than bureaucracy. It was a place where reality stayed put. Several weeks after the plea, Maya received a copy of the transcript. She read the section where Trent admitted the fraudulent transfers. Then she closed the file. "Do you want to keep it?" I asked. "My lawyer can keep it," she said. "You do not want a copy at home." "No, Ma, I spent enough years living with his version of events. I do not want to spend the next years living with the case file either." She placed the transcript in a box with legal documents scheduled to go to secure storage. Then she went outside to help Malik rake leaves. I watched from the window as he deliberately pushed a pile over her shoes. She kicked leaves back at him. Within seconds, they were throwing handfuls at each other across my lawn. There are victories that look like a guilty plea. There are others that look like a woman laughing while her son covers her in October leaves. I knew which one mattered more. Sentencing came in winter. Chicago had turned gray, the lake hard and metallic beneath a sky that seemed to press down on the city. By then, the divorce was close to resolution, the major financial tracing questions had been answered, and the constant emergency feeling had faded. I almost resented the sentencing date for dragging us back into a chapter we were learning to leave behind. Maya had the right to submit a victim impact statement. She rewrote it 6 times. The first version was angry. The second was legalistic. The third sounded like something her attorney might have written. The fourth focused almost entirely on Malik. The fifth was so restrained that I asked whether she was protecting Trent from hearing the truth. She looked at me and said, "No, I am protecting myself from performing pain for him." The 6th version was the one she read. She did not list every insult or every bruise. She explained the practical consequences of living with someone who controlled information. She described how she stopped trusting her own memory because account balances changed and documents disappeared. She described sleeping lightly because she could tell from Trent's footsteps whether an argument was coming. She described watching Malik become quieter and more watchful. She told the court that the stolen money mattered because it had been designed to give her independence, and that taking it while making her afraid to ask questions was not a separate financial act. It was part of the same system of control. Then she said something I had not seen in any draft. "I do not need the court to make him understand me," she said. "I spent too long trying to make him understand. I need the court to hold him responsible for what he chose to do." Trent stared at the table. When it was his turn to speak, he apologized. Some of it sounded rehearsed, some of it did not. He said he had become obsessed with maintaining a lifestyle and proving he was successful. He said he resented the fact that my company and Maya's trust represented security he had not created. He said he began telling himself he deserved access because he was Maya's husband. He admitted that every time he crossed a line and nothing immediate happened, the next line became easier to cross. He did not blame Lucille. That was the first time I believed he had understood even a small part of what he had done. Understanding did not erase consequence. The judge imposed a substantial federal prison sentence within the range set by the plea agreement and sentencing rules, followed by supervised release. The court entered restitution orders tied to the proven losses and forfeiture orders covering assets connected to the scheme. I will not pretend I memorized the number of months with satisfaction. By then, counting years felt less important than knowing the money had been secured and the lies had been fixed in the record. Lucille was sentenced separately. Her cooperation reduced her exposure, but the judge emphasized that she had not been a passive mother following her son's instructions. She had opened accounts, signed ownership documents, sold property that was not hers, and encouraged the concealment of assets. Her sentence was shorter than Trent's and still serious. Restitution obligations followed her as well. When she was allowed to speak, Lucille cried. I had seen her cry before, but never at the dining table when Maya hit the floor. That memory prevented pity from turning into forgiveness on command. Still, I no longer needed to hate her. She looked toward Maya and said, I was cruel to you because I thought kindness meant weakness. Maya did not answer. The judge did not ask her to. Outside the courthouse, snow had begun to fall in thin, dry flakes. Malik was waiting with my driver because Maya had not wanted him inside for sentencing. He stood when we approached the car. Is it over? He asked. Maya considered the question. The court part is almost over, she said. That was the right answer. Legal proceedings could reach judgments. Healing did not have a clerk who stamped final on the last page. The divorce became final several weeks later. There was no dramatic signature across a metal table. There were negotiated terms, court-approved divisions, separate property findings, sale arrangements, and schedules prepared by professionals. Maya retained her separate trust and the recovered funds associated with it. The marital property was divided according to the settlement and court orders rather than according to my desire for revenge. The suburban house was sold after the relevant restraints were lifted. Maya never returned after the final supervised retrieval. A real estate agent asked whether she wanted to keep the dining table as part of the sale inventory. Leave it, she said. The buyer could have it or throw it away. The proceeds due to each side were handled through the court-approved process, with Trent's portion subject to lawful claims and restitution where applicable. That detail disappointed people who wanted a fairy tale ending in which one clever clause handed my daughter everything. I came to appreciate the less magical version. Maya did not need to become wealthy because Trent became poor. She already had resources. What she needed was lawful ownership, transparent account safety, and the freedom to make decisions without fear. The $4.2 million was restored through the asset recovery process after tracing and court approvals. Not every cent arrived on the same day, and not every loss was perfectly recoverable. Fees, disputed funds, and separate restitution issues took time, but the core trust was made whole. Marcus called Maya, not me, when the final major transfer posted. She came into my study holding her phone. It is back, she said. I expected relief to look larger. Instead, she sat on the arm of my chair and closed her eyes. After a moment, she said, I thought I would feel rich. What do you feel, tired? I took her hand. Then be tired, I said. The money can wait until tomorrow. For once, there was nothing else we had to do that night. Sterling Freight survived the scandal because the company had never actually entered the warehouse partnership. Trent thought he was stealing. The proposal had been bait built from a real parcel we had once evaluated and abandoned. No customer money had been put at risk. No employee retirement account had financed my trap. My lawyers had insisted on those boundaries, and they were right. Even so, I had to answer to my board. The meeting took place on a Monday morning in the same executive conference room where I had spent decades negotiating acquisitions. I expected concern. I received something harder: accountability. One director asked why I had involved a company document in a personal family matter. Another asked what would have happened if Trent had read the agreement closely and tried to act on it before we could stop him. A third asked whether my personal authority as founder had allowed the plan to move without enough independent review. 10 years earlier, I might have bristled. I might have reminded them whose name was on the building. Instead, I answered. I told them my legal team had ring-fenced the proposed transaction, that no binding capital commitment could occur without additional board approvals, and that the disclosure schedules had been used to document representations rather than transfer company assets. Then I admitted the uncomfortable part: I had been so certain of my ability to control the trap that I had treated some internal safeguards as obstacles to work around. That was not acceptable, simply because the target deserved scrutiny. We adopted new rules requiring independent board review whenever a proposed transaction involved a close relative of a senior executive or founder. We tightened controls around special purpose entities and executive exceptions. I voluntarily gave up an override authority I had held for years. One director looked surprised. You built that authority into the company charter yourself, he said. I know. And you are giving it up because of Trent? No, I said. I am giving it up because a control is not a control if it depends on me always being right. The room went quiet. That might have been the most important business lesson I took from the entire disaster. For 40 years I had been proud that I could see risks other people missed. But age had taught me something ambition rarely does. Being experienced is not the same as being incapable of error. Trent's arrogance was obvious because it was loud. Mine could be quieter. Mine could sound like competence. I did not retire. Trent had wanted to believe I was an exhausted old woman, ready to hand him the keys, and I enjoyed proving him wrong too much to disappear immediately. But I changed how I worked. I began transferring more operational authority to executives who had earned it. I spent fewer 14-hour days in the office. I stopped treating every problem as evidence that I alone was still indispensable. Maya never joined Sterling Freight full-time. That pleased me. For years I had assumed the company would eventually become part of her life, simply because it was part of mine. After the divorce, I realized inheritance could become pressure if I was not careful. Maya agreed to serve on a trust oversight committee and to learn the financial structures that affected her and Malik, but she chose her own pace. One afternoon, she walked through the loading yard with me. Tractor trailers moved in disciplined lines while dispatch radios crackled from the terminal. "Dad would be proud of this," she said. I looked around at the company Elias and I had started with one unreliable truck. "He would be proud of you." For what, she asked. "Surviving." "For deciding survival is not the only thing you are allowed to do." She smiled. "Then what am I allowed to do? Anything that is yours." That answer applied to Malik, too. He began looking at colleges with strong computer science and engineering programs. He was fascinated by security, but the family case had changed the way he talked about it. He asked questions about privacy authorization and evidence handling. He wanted to understand not only how systems could be penetrated, but how they should be protected and audited. At dinner one night, he announced that he might study cybersecurity. Maya froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. He laughed. "Legally, Mom." She threw a napkin at him. I laughed so hard I had to put down my glass. The sound surprised me. During the worst weeks, even laughter had felt disloyal, as if enjoying anything meant I was forgetting what happened. But pain does not become more valid because you keep feeding it. We began building ordinary routines on purpose. Sunday breakfast at my house. A rule that no one discussed court documents at the table unless there was an emergency. Walks by the lake. Movies Malik chose and Maya complained about. Calls from Marcus that went directly to Maya. Board meetings I sometimes left before sunset. The great revenge I had imagined in the first hours after seeing Maya's bruises had been fire freeze. The accounts expose the thieves, destroy the people who hurt her. The life we built afterward required something less dramatic and more difficult. Space. A year after the dinner that changed everything, Maya asked whether we could have prime rib again. For a second I thought she was joking. We had avoided it without discussing why. The smell had become attached in my mind to shattered glass blood on a napkin. Lucille's slow applause and Trent's voice turning ugly. Even at restaurants I found myself choosing something else. Maya noticed. "That is why I want it," she said. "I do not want him owning a meal." So on a cool Friday evening, almost exactly 1 year after the raid, we set the dining room at my Lake Michigan house. Not the formal room with the longest table. Maya chose the smaller room beside the kitchen where the windows faced the water. Malik cooked with the confidence of a 16-year-old who had watched 3 videos and therefore considered himself a chef. He oversalted the potatoes. Maya accused him of trying to raise everyone's blood pressure. I opened a bottle of wine and used ordinary glasses. No crystal. Not because crystal frightened us, because ordinary glasses were easier. Maya wore a soft green blouse with short sleeves. The skin on her forearms was clear. She wore Malik's cheap silver bracelet and no other jewelry. The diamond bracelet recovered from Lucille remained in a safe under Maya's control. The emerald brooch rested inside my old coat upstairs. We had learned that recovered property did not have to be displayed to prove it had been reclaimed. Halfway through dinner, Malik looked at his mother. "Do you ever miss Dad?" The question stopped the room. A year earlier, I would have wanted to protect Maya from it. I would have changed the subject or given Malik an answer shaped by my anger. Maya put down her fork. "Sometimes," she said. Malik stared at his plate. "Me too. That does not mean what he did was okay." "I know. And it does not mean you have to talk to him before you are ready." "I know." Maya reached across the table. "You can love someone and still need to be safe from them." Malik took her hand. I looked toward this dark lake and thought about all the simple rules I had carried through business. Identify the risk trace, the loss protect the asset, close the exit. They had helped us. They had also been incomplete. People were not cargo. Maya was not an account to secure. Malik was not evidence. Even Trent was not simply an enemy in a strategy. How was a man who had made choices and would live with their consequences? If I reduced the story to how cleverly I defeated him, I would repeat a smaller version of his mistake, treating everyone else as pieces arranged around my will. What mattered most was that Maya had her will back. After dinner, Malik carried plates to the kitchen. He had grown several inches and was talking constantly about college applications. Maya followed with the serving dish. I stayed at the table for a moment. The room was quiet. No one was afraid of the quiet. That difference was enormous. My phone buzzed with a message from Sterling Freight. A regional manager wanted approval for a weekend routing change. For most of my life, I would have answered immediately. I turned the phone face down. From the kitchen, Maya called Mom. "Are you helping or supervising?" "Supervising," I called back. She laughed. "Of course you are." I stood and carried the glasses in. Later we went outside with blankets and sat near the lake. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance. Malik talked about a campus he wanted to visit. Maya talked about finding a place of her own in the spring, somewhere with enough room for Malik when he came home from school, but not so large that empty rooms would feel like obligations. I did not offer to buy it. That restraint took effort. "Tell me when you want another set of eyes on the contract," I said. She smiled at me. "I will." There it was again, choice. Months earlier, when I saw the bruises on Maya's arm, I believed the best thing I could do was become more powerful than the people hurting her. In the short term, I was right. Power mattered. Money paid lawyers. Relationships opened doors. Experience helped me recognize patterns. Planning prevented Trent from moving the funds before investigators could act. But power alone could not restore what control had damaged. That required returning decisions. It required letting Maya say no to my help. It required letting Malik admit he missed his father without treating the feeling as betrayal. It required accepting that courts would follow rules rather than my preferred script. It required admitting when the legal logic of my own trap needed professionals to correct it. It required understanding that justice and revenge can travel together for a while, then reach a fork where you have to choose which road you actually want. I had wanted Trent and Lucille to lose everything. What I wanted now was smaller and larger at the same time. I wanted Maya to open her own bank statements without fear. I wanted Malik to use his intelligence for a future instead of a crisis. I wanted Sunday dinners where nobody monitored footsteps. I wanted my company to survive me without needing my hand on every lever. I wanted to remember Elias without every heirloom becoming evidence. I wanted quiet that felt like quiet. Before we went inside, Maya stood beside me at the edge of the lawn. The wind lifted her hair. "You know what the strangest part is?" she said. "What for years I thought leaving would destroy my life." She looked back through the windows at Malik, who was inside stealing the last piece of pie. "It did not destroy my life," she said. "It showed me which parts were actually mine." I put my arm around her shoulders. There was no applause. No judge turned pale. No crowd watched. No one needed to. The most satisfying ending was not the sound of handcuffs closing around Trent's wrists or the sight of Lucille being led past flashing lights. It was my daughter standing beside me without hiding her arms, talking about a future she had chosen. Trent once thought control made him powerful. Lucille thought cruelty proved strength. I spent much of my life believing victory meant leaving an opponent with no move. We were all wrong in different ways. Real strength was the ability to have a choice and not use it to become cruel. Real victory was getting your life back and recognizing it when it returned. That night, after Maya and Malik went upstairs, I walked through the kitchen and turned off the lights. On the counter sat 3 ordinary wine glasses drying beside the sink. I smiled. Then I went to bed.